Hi, welcome. My name is Jeremy Beanster Vanderweel. I'm privileged to introduce today's sessions. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and a researcher. I'm director of child and adolescent psychiatry at Columbia. It's my privilege to welcome you to this How to Do CAP Research Workshop series, which is a DEI initiative sponsored by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's Abramson Grant. This is a monthly series that aims to address the barrier to entry into research by providing an overview of fundamental research skills, and also aims to showcase the diversity of child and adolescent psychiatry research topics as well as research mentors. The series is intended for individuals at all career stages interested in child and adolescent psychiatry research and in the incorporation of diversity, equity, and inclusivity principles in research endeavors. We hope to inspire folks from diverse backgrounds and in all career stages to participate in research, explore ACAP resources, and apply for ACAP research opportunities. Throughout the series, we feature diverse child and adolescent psychiatry researchers who will share their wide array of research topics and career wisdom and introduce foundational research concepts such as how to get started in research, finding a mentor, developing a research idea, finding funding, presenting and publishing, and much more. Each of the hour-long sessions starts with a research mentor sharing their career trajectory and then using their own research to explain a foundational research concept. They then close the discussion by sharing 5 overall pearls about engaging in child and adolescent psychiatry research. We save the last 10 minutes for Q&A, and during the session, feel free to put questions into the chat. And the facilitator, that's me, will help share these questions during the Q&A portion of the session. You can also submit questions anonymously by submitting them as direct messages to me, and then I can convey them. As you probably heard at the beginning, the session is recorded. And the point of this is so that it can become a living resource for folks who may not be able to join this particular session. So for today's session, we have the honor of learning from Dr. Wanjiku Njoroge, and I am going to just do a brief introduction. We'll try to do you justice, Wanjiku. Wanjiku is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, as well as the Associate Chair of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She's faculty at the Policy Lab and medical director of the Young Child Clinic at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. That's a lot. So as I understand it, Wanjiku, you did your bachelor's work at Columbia and then medical school at Baylor, went to the University of Pennsylvania for psychiatry residency, and then did your child psychiatry fellowship at Yale Child Study Center, followed by postgraduate training in the Harris Infant Psychiatry Fellowship, as well as the Klingenstein and IMH Research Fellowship and the Ziegler Center in Child Development and Social Policy at the Yale Child Study Center. Also served as Solnit Fellow at 0 to 3. Wanjiku has received numerous research awards, including from NIMH, as well as NICHD, the University of Pennsylvania Provost Award, and is a distinguished fellow in ACAP. In addition to many articles, online blogs, Wanjiku has co-edited a textbook that's a clinical guide to psychiatric assessment of infants and young children, and can frequently be found on the media. So somebody that you can Google and find online video. So as I understand it, Wanjiku's research focus has been on health equity, diversity, and inclusion, particularly focused on early childhood development and parenting, with particular emphasis on prevention, promotion, and early intervention in early childhood. So I'm pleased to be able to hand things off, and I'm here if you have any technical difficulties. Otherwise, I'll fade to the background. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. And thank you guys for inviting me, Cindy, to participate in this really fantastic series. So let me share my screen. Okay, I'm going to reduce this. Okay, let me put this down. Okay, so as you heard, Wanjiku Njoroge, I am here at CHOP and Penn, and I didn't know about the 5 pearls, but we can figure that out. But for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my pathway, as I think it might be different. I mean, I know that you've talked to some other folks, and so I'd be very interested to hear your impressions at the end of my talk about whether or not this is as unique as I think that it is. But hopefully, the goal of the series is to let you all know that there are, just vast differences in how we all end up as physician scientists. And this was my path. So, for the first part of the career trajectory, it is probably what used to be considered fairly standard. So, as Jeremy already said, I went to Columbia for my undergrad experience. And while I was at Columbia in my senior year, I was able to do a course at Barnard with the Barnard Toddler Center. And that was really my first sort of entry into research. And during that course, we also had a piece of it where we were actively recruiting parents and families to participate in this strange situation. And so for those of you who know it, this was really very impactful for me, because it really was the very first time I really had heard anything or seen anything around attachment and attachment styles by recruiting moms and babies, really toddlers, like 15, 18 months into the lab, where we filmed them doing these various observations with separation and reunions, introduction of strangers. And again, we sort of recorded it. We were very clear about the data. This study had been running for years. So there's an incredible and rich amount of data. And this is really the first time that for a year I was embedded in a lab with, at that time, Larry Aber, doing this work. As a part of this course, we also spent some time in an active toddler center, which had a one-way mirror where students and parents and all kinds of folks sit behind the mirror, and in the front of the mirror was really like a preschool where we had toddlers and early care providers. These toddlers were the same folks, though, who were part of the lab part of this course. So it was a really kind of very cool course and an interesting look at research. At the time, it didn't really mean anything to me other than this is a really cool course. I'm a senior, and this is a really nice way to go out, playing with babies and toddlers and their parents, and meeting a lot of really interesting peers who are interested. And usually, I think most of us are pre-med, or there are some folks who are interested in going to grad school in clinical psychology. But again, fun didn't really mean much to me. So then I left New York and went down to Houston. I went to Baylor. And again, as we all know, I was just head down getting through med school. At that time, it was very different than it is for med students nowadays. And we just had a ton of work and not a lot of free time. There really wasn't time to do anything else, but Baylor had a bit of a reduced curriculum, which meant that we got through our basic sciences in 18 months. And so what that meant was that you had a lot of time during sort of the last couple of years to have all kinds of interesting experiences and to do research, to do away electives, to kind of just hang out. And so one of the things that I did during my family medicine rotation was end up doing research. So to be fair, we did not realize that what we were getting into, what we had been told by the attending at the time and the chair of family medicine, Dr. Hergenroeder, was that if we did this research and it was really interesting, we might be able to win a free trip to San Francisco to present our research at a conference. So we were all in at the idea of going to San Francisco for free. And so I, along with two friends, ended up creating this research project. And so the three of us were interested in various things, right? So one was interested in adolescent medicine, one was interested in OB, and then I was psych, but I was PD psych. So we tried to figure out what we could do together. We were all women of color. One was from the West Indies, one was a Latina, and then there was me. And so we really decided we would focus on girls and girls of color. So we did our lit search, the first time we had really ever done that. We sort of came up with an idea about our project. And what we decided we would do is that we really were interested in that time. Again, the study could likely not be done today, as this was in Texas. But we were very interested in the ways in which adolescent girls understood about their reproductive health. And we were very concerned about the increasing rates of HPV and the links with HPV to cervical cancer. So after we did this lit search, we kind of, decided on the topic. We knew we were doing some reproductive justice work with specifically with girls of color. Then we had to figure out where we're going to find these girls of color. So we started looking at schools in the Houston area, and we were able to partner with a school that also happened to have a clinic attached to it. So then we had to sort of write up our idea with Dr. Hergenroder and his team's help, go through the IRB, develop all these various consent forms and assent forms as we were trying to get, teenage girls who were anywhere from freshmen to seniors in this high school. We had to get permission from the school itself to be able to do the study. We had to get consent from the parents and assent from the girls. So we sort of did all of this. And then we realized, like, okay, so now we have this, we're ready to go. We had written a skit because our idea was that we would do this pre-test for these girls and test their knowledge around HPV and cervical cancer and just their reproductive health and well-being. Then we would do a skit where we'd sort of teach them principles about how important it was for them to have regular gynecological checks and thinking about if they were sexually active, making sure that they were protected, and the links between HPV and cervical cancer, and then coming back 6 months later and doing a follow-up post-test, see if our skit sort of did anything for them in terms of their knowledge. So we did that. So as you can just sort of tell from what I'm telling you, like our little idea about going to San Francisco for free, like did not merit at all what we ended up doing in terms of the work. It ended up taking several years. And by the time everything was said and done, we were all interns all across the country and could not go to the conference, even though we wanted to. What was meaningful about this entire process was, one, none of us had done research before. I mean, other than that thing I told you about at Columbia, that was it for me. And for my friends Gracie and Riva, they hadn't even done anything in undergrad. So this was completely new from us, right? Trying to figure out, doing our first lit searches, coming up with a topic, coalescing around what we thought was really important at the time, finding a site that would host us, getting all of our friends who had any kind of theatrical abilities to do this skit, writing this skit, rewriting this skit, having them act in the skit, going out to the school, getting the parents to consent, getting the girls to assent, and then actually running the skit in the school, doing all of the pre-tests, the tests right after the skit, and then going back 6 months later to do the post-test. It was an incredible amount of work. But what was really cool about this experience was what we found with the girls. So the girls who participated in the study and who saw the skit were really able to retain the information 6 months later. But what was even cooler than that, which is like, yes, amazing, we're helping girls with reproductive health, but girls whose parents had not consented for them to participate also ended up knowing about the study as we ran into them in the hallways when we were there visiting and going back for the 6-month follow-up. And even cooler than that was that the clinic that was based at this school was super excited because they had all these young women coming in wanting to inquire about pap smears, concerned about the possibility of HPV, wanting to make sure that their health was protected because of the link that they now knew between HPV and cervical cancer that could only be determined through pap smears. So this was really amazing in that we had made a difference in the lives of these young women who were in the study and just their friends, right? Just through word of mouth from this really sort of one-time inoculation with like a booster 6 months later. And the booster, again, we didn't go back in and redo the skit. We just went back in and gave them the survey that we had developed for the 6-month follow-up. So that was really the first time that I recognized that we could create our own research, we could create our own project, and that we could actually move the needle in terms of health for our purposes with young girls of color. Okay, so then I left Baylor and I went to Penn. So at Penn, I was a resident, I was fast tracking, I was getting through residency in 3 years, so there was no research. And in fact, during Penn, we were working on writing the article that I just showed you from the Baylor study. So after Penn, I ended up going to Yale, where I did my child psychiatry fellowship. At Yale at the time, the training director was and still is Dorothy Stubbe. And as a second year fellow, everyone had to do a grand rounds. And so I was trying to figure out what my grand rounds talk was going to be about. At the same time, I was looking for jobs. Nothing was really clicking for me. It wasn't really sure what I was going to do. And I ended up sort of being very interested in this idea of the Clark doll studies. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, these were studies that were done by Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, really in the 1930s to the 1940s. And they were very interested and very concerned about the impact that segregation was having on young Black children. So they did these huge amount of studies in the then segregated South and the integrated North, looking at Black children ages 3 to 5. And they asked them a series of questions. So they had these two dolls, one doll that was a Black doll, one doll that was a white doll. And they were trying to understand how these children felt about these two dolls and what that might mean for how they felt about themselves. What they found, and for a large amount of the children who were in the South, the segregated South, the Black children, was they ended up having these sort of negative views of these dolls. So the questions they asked was like, who was the smart doll? Who was the pretty doll? Which doll do you like most? Which doll would you want to be your friend? Which doll looks most like you? So what their study was really showing in the 30s and 40s was really the impact that segregation was having on young children's Black self-esteem. And this was incredibly impactful because not only was this really sort of the first time that this kind of research had been done, but unbeknownst to them, about a decade later in the 1950s, this young lawyer who you might recognize as Thurgood Marshall and colleagues used their research and presented it for the very first time in front of the Supreme Court. So this was historic, right? It was the first time that the Supreme Court had ever heard any kind of developmental psychological literature that they used to make the case in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation was indeed harmful. And then that led to ostensibly the integration of schools. So I was really, really interested in the Clark study. I was interested in the way in which developmental research had been really led to these policy changes, which had these sort of massive implications for children and families who were living under segregation in the 50s and 60s. And I replicated this study, but sort of updating it for the then early 2000s, early to sort of mid 2000s, which is when I did my study at Yale. So I sort of had this idea, presented this grand rounds, had the sort of kernel of an idea of a study that I would do. But again, I was a second year child psychiatry fellow, getting ready to graduate without a job. So at that time, my training director called me into her office and said to me, most people have jobs by now. My grand rounds was like, I don't know, sometime in the spring of my second year. And she's like, and those that don't have jobs typically do another fellowship. And I was like, there's no way, I've done like 5 years, I'm going to go out there and do things, but I had no idea what I was going to do. So at the same time, I was taking an elective in what we called the Child Development Unit, or the CDU, which was a clinic at Yale where we saw kids under the age of 5. And I loved that clinic. And so I was thinking about the doll study and how much I loved that presentation, doing the lit search, putting it together. I loved this clinic. And they called me again and again and asked me if I would think about doing an infant psychiatry fellowship. No such thing existed at Yale. At the same time, I was doing a 0 to 3 fellowship or applying for it at the time and sort of meeting those folks. And I ran into someone who had been at Yale, 7 years earlier, who told me that he had done an infant psychiatry fellowship so that it could be done, even though it didn't currently exist. So I also went down to Tulane and talked to Charlie Zena at that time about his infant psychiatry fellowship, which was in existence, had a current fellow who's Mary Margaret Gleason. And then I sort of came back to Yale, talked to folks again, tried to figure out Yale or Tulane. Both have the ability to do an infant fellowship as well as research, because at that point I knew I wanted to sort of marry the two. So this is one time I did not leave, and I stayed at Yale, and I did the T32, the research training fellowship. I did an infant psychiatry fellowship simultaneously, and I also did the Ed Ziegler policy fellowship. So I sort of did those things all at the same time, all around the same topic, which is really thinking about race and equity and early child development. So that took, several years. But at the end of the day, I really knew what I wanted to do, right? I had this beautiful mixture of this sort of clinical practice with very young children, with research with very young children, and policy with very young children, all underneath this umbrella of equity, disparities, and race. But it was time to leave. So once again, I hopped on a plane, and this time I went to someplace familiar, which was coming back down to Philadelphia, and I went to CHOP. I had met Tammy Benton as an intern and had sort of been talking to her throughout the years when I left Penn and went to Yale. And she recruited me back to CHOP to start the Young Child Clinic. The Young Child Clinic is a clinic where we see children under the age of 5. And it was very much modeled on the CDU at Yale and the experience I'd had at Yale as an infant fellow. So I sort of replicated that as much as I possibly could, being the only child psychiatrist at CHOP and not having any of the sort of breadth of other folks that I had at the Yale Child Studies Center. But I spent so much time building the clinic and using it as a training clinic to train up psychiatry residents, the CAP fellows, medical students, and anyone else who was interested, that I really wasn't doing any research, right? I just spent all this time at Yale, like after my child fellowship, doing all these other fellowships. And the only thing I was using was the infant psychiatry fellowship. And so I really realized that I needed a little bit more depth to my research. Now, not like in terms of training, but just in terms of having a better understanding of the way in which to actually do research. So I talked with Tammy, Dr. Benton at the time, and Dr. Weller, who had been the child chair, and recognized that what I needed, I was likely not to be able to get at CHOP. So hopped another plane, and I went out to Seattle. And I went to Seattle really to work with Dimitri Christakis, who is a pediatrician, who does media research. And it wasn't that I was interested in media necessarily. When I was doing my studies at Yale, part of what I'd asked families to get an understanding about their child's understanding of race, ethnicity, and gender, I asked about media, right? Because so many young children are exposed to different forms of media, but I wasn't a media researcher per se. But Dimitri was not only a media researcher, but he'd been doing research in Seattle for decades. And he'd been doing research in Seattle with very little people and families. And so he had this understanding of the ways in which to recruit diverse families into research. He was doing longitudinal research where he was following these like little people up into school age. He was asking all kinds of questions, and he was using his research to influence policy. So those were the pieces that I really wanted to understand how to do a little bit better. So went to Seattle Children's Hospital, UW, and from my work with Dimitri, I got my first authored publication in JAMA Peds. And so again, it was looking at Dimitri's work, but looking at it through my lens of race and culture and equity, and really sort of blending that together. So it was hugely impactful. I learned a lot from being in Seattle, but I also learned that I needed sun in my life. And while Seattle is stunningly beautiful in the summer and will be stunningly beautiful in October for the annual meeting, I realized that probably wasn't a place where I was going to spend the rest of my career. Again, as the story goes, I retained all of my mentors from Yale, Penn, and CHOP. Was talking to Dr. Benton again, who had encouraged my flight to Seattle. And of no surprise, she recruited me back. At this point, she was now interim chair, to be chair of the child psychiatry department at CHOP. So I'd done all this work, right? And now I was back to think about what is my program of research going to be. These two buildings on the screen were not created when I had left Philly. One is our sort of new sort of outpatient clinical hub, Berger, which is where my clinic used to be. My young child clinic was moved to Berger. And then this tower over here on the right is the research tower, which is where my office is. So let me talk to you guys a little bit about the importance of early child development so I can convince you all not only to do a CAP fellowship, but to perhaps do an infant psychiatry fellowship. The reason why I find this age so impactful is because 90% of the brain develops in this time. 90% develops before the age of 5, which means if you want to do the work that I want to do, hopefully some of you want to do, which is prevention, promotion, and early intervention, this is the time to do it, right? And this is one of my favorite slides because you can see how much stuff is happening in the first 5 years of life. Really, in the first 3, where about 80 to 85% of the brain develops. So again, I used sort of this knowledge. I worked with colleagues to that book that Jeremy mentioned that I wrote with some buddies actually from ACAP, where we really were helping people to understand how to assess very young children and families in using a cultural framework, which we thought was really important. The other part about brain development, which is so incredibly important, is that we know now from decades of research what happens when this system is stressed, right? We know a little bit of stress is okay, even if it's elevated for little points of time. But if these little developing brains are sort of hit with this unremitting, prolonged stress, in the absence of supportive, nurturing, loving relationships, we can have significant problems and significant troubles. What that might look like is this slide, right? Where you can see what happens if this brain is sort of receiving all of this cortisol without any sort of interruption. And so again, I sort of am running through what I hope you guys find interesting and will learn more about throughout your various phases of training. But this is why I do what I do, right? It's sort of recognizing what can go wrong in the earliest few years and knowing that we can prevent this or at least intervene. Okay, so the other thing I think it's important when we're thinking about early childhood development is really understanding that children are living within these various systems, right? So this Bronfenbrenner guide is something that I saw in college for the very first time. Never thought I'd be using it in my life. And yet I go back to it again and again and again, because we need to recognize if we're trying to really help and support families with very young children, understanding where children are living, understanding the systems in which they're interacting, understanding there's sort of multiple systems that are happening simultaneously, and also recognizing this is all happening in a context of children under the age of 18 that are more diverse than ever in the history of the United States. And so recognizing that children under 18 who are from diverse backgrounds have very different experiences. What was really meaningful about sort of my interest in this work was what happened around 2019, when for the very first time, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a policy statement, which again is a huge deal because AAP has such a large footprint, not only when it comes to pediatric health, but when it comes to like sort of the nation understanding pediatric health. So they put out this policy statement where they really talked about racism specifically. And they named it, right? They didn't sort of use any other language. They said specifically about the profound impact that racism has on children. And that, again, coming from that particular body, really began to resonate, I think, not just across the field of pediatrics, but really across the nation, across researchers, NIH, NIMH, NICHD, as well as across the feds when it comes to thinking about policymakers and our elected officials. So my research program was really starting to come together, right? So I'm working on the earliest years. We now have buy-in from all these different folks, but what I've been doing since I was at Yale, and what the Clark had been doing since the 1930s and 40s, which was really talking about the ways in which racism and discrimination impacted health, maternal health, child health, the health together, understanding all of this. And this led to another paper that I did with some colleagues, again, from ACAP, Dr. Uji Berry, who was at NYU, Dr. Malyan Tombon, who was at Georgetown, and all of us are working in the earliest years, and all of us are interested in health equity. So I had it. I figured out. I was back at CHOP. I was in my new beautiful research tower office, and then this happened. And it's amazing to think now, 4 years later, to remember what things were like back at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. But probably like many of you, I just wasn't sleeping. I mean, I had family all across the world. People were calling. I was concerned. Had my parents on lockdown in the Midwest. Was talking to my little brother who's out in Hawaii. Just really trying to figure out what was going on and how to keep everyone safe. And then thinking about my clinic, right? My young child clinic, how we're going to keep those kids safe. We had a wait list. Parents didn't want to stop coming in. We kept open. All of these things were of concern. So I just wasn't sleeping. And I started reading the papers, like every paper I get my hands on. I was on the internet all the time. And I started collecting headlines. And it was a drumbeat that got louder and louder and louder throughout the pandemic, where we really began to understand the disproportionality. Now, up until this point, we had had a tagline, right? That we're all in this together, we should protect one another, this is impacting us all. And what we started realizing as the CDC started publishing numbers and we started looking at the data was that we weren't all in this together, right? That there were differences secondary to structural inequities, which we had known about, which we have known about, but which we have done very little about as a nation. So at the same time this happened, my brother's a historian, and so I happened to be reading the Philadelphia Negro. And so I started thinking about structural racism, specifically redlining, as I was reading these headlines, looking at these data, reading the articles that were sort of coming out that were specifically focused on race. And I know by now all of us are very familiar with redlining. And as you can see here on this slide, this is a map of Philly. Actually, this is the original redlining map of Philly, which is actually in Penn's campus. And what's important about this, as you will see, when we think about the impact that redlining has had, and as we've seen it play out during the pandemic, is when you look at the map that Brewer made of Philly in 1937, which again is here, this is the second map, and you look at the map that the Pennsylvania Department of Health put out in 2020 of Philadelphia with respect to COVID positivity, you'll see that the neighborhoods that were historically redlined, which are the neighborhoods where Black folk were living, are the same neighborhoods where they had increased COVID positivity, which are still in the same neighborhoods where Black folk are living. Our colleagues at Drexel put out a series of maps, as you can see. And again, these maps all echo the historical redlining maps, where they were looking at housing inequities, COVID positivity, COVID deaths, all along these historical lines that were drawn by J.M. Brewer in 1937. And here we're talking about March through August of 2020. So let's put it all together. Had this interest in looking at really the littlest of people, understanding the importance of the earliest years of life, really with a focus on health equity and Black moms, Black babies, and Black families, and COVID, which led to the framework of my current project, which was really thinking about what was happening in 2020 as a syndemic. Now, the syndemic framework is one that is probably familiar to many of you, particularly those of you who've done sort of any reading or understanding of HIV research, which is really where this was first created back in the 80s. And what's important when we're thinking about a syndemic is its definition is an aggregation of two or more endemic and epidemic conditions. So in the original definition, the epidemic was HIV, and the endemic condition was poverty and race. In our framework, the epidemic, COVID-19, the endemic is poverty and race, but more specifically, structural racism and the ways in which that has impacted how certain families experienced and are continuing to experience the pandemic. So a colleague in Florida, Gravely, sort of had this really brilliant article in the American Journal of Human Biology with a very sort of similar figure, but it's all about adults. So like I and some other colleagues called and were like, hey, we really sort of think this is really important, but there were two pediatricians and me, we're all doing pediatrics. And so we asked him if we could sort of take his figure and change it so that it reflected our interests in the population that we serve. And he said, great, was incredibly gracious and has been lovely throughout the past 4 years. So as you can see from this framework, we're looking at the things I've been looking at for forever, right? Structural racism, these sort of social environments. We're understanding how that and the COVID-19 pandemic come together into the syndemic and what that means for both pathways and what's most important, child outcomes. So we did a series of studies. The first one began with recruiting moms who were pregnant. This up here says pregnancy study time 1. And this was really where we sent out a survey to all of the pregnant women who were in the Penn Health system during the initial shutdown, just to see like how they were doing. It was a super brief survey. We recruited a ton of women. I'm only highlighting the Black and the non-Latinx white women, though we also had Asian women, a few Latinx women, and a few multiracial women. But for the purposes of our discussion tonight, I'm just highlighting this binary group. What we recognize from the very first survey, where there were differences, again, should be no surprise to any of you by now, between the Black women's responses and the non-Latinx white women's responses. Where the Black women had more worries, they were worried about their health, they were worried about their baby's health, they were worried about their employment. They had all these concerns that the non-Latinx white women just didn't have. We followed these women to delivery, the delivery stage is time 2. Again, looking at the Black women specifically compared with the non-Latinx white women. Black women, again, had different experiences and different concerns. They were more distressed during their delivery. They were more likely to fear for the life of their child, which again, considering the rate of Black maternal morbidity and mortality and Black infant morbidity and mortality makes complete sense. And if you remember, back at the very beginning of the pandemic, women's birth plans were thrown out the window, right? Women were not allowed to have initially anyone in the L&D room with them, just them and their team. Then they sort of changed that at some point in like sort of the maybe fall of 2020, winter 2020, 2021, where women were able then to have someone in the L&D suite with them, but only one person. So for women who'd had these plans of having like their partner and maybe their sister or whomever they wanted, those plans were gone. For Black women, this was incredibly impactful because of the rates we just talked about of Black maternal morbidity and mortality. They were concerned that they wouldn't live through the delivery of their baby or their babies wouldn't survive. And now the supports and these networks they had around them to help support them weren't going to be able to be there. So they were incredibly distressed and incredibly concerned. They also reported having higher experiences of racism, which also impacted their feeling about sort of all of this. We then followed them in the postpartum period, again, looking at Black women and non-Latinx white women. And at this point, I was very interested again, still in understanding more about structural factors, right? And so then for my portion of this particular study, I was really looking at Those designations we talked about in the 1930s and 40s, they were happening all across the United States with redlining that was done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. And so we were looking at those designations for the women that we had recruited into these studies back during pregnancy. As you can see from this figure here, which we had published in JAMA Psychiatry in 2022, we were mapping the women from our study onto these historical maps. And of no surprise, the majority of our Black women were living in these areas that had been deemed hazardous, which is what the redlined neighborhoods were back in the 30s. And here in 2020, when these women were initially recruited into the pregnancy study, and then again when they were followed, were still living, the majority of them, in neighborhoods that had been redlined. What we know from those women in these data were that women who reported these sort of higher racism scores and sort of negative COVID-19 experiences had association with increased risks for postpartum depression and anxiety. We saw it with structural racism. We asked them again with their sort of own experiences of racism, their sort of interpersonal experiences, and we saw it again. We then did a 12-month study at time 4, where we again are continuing to follow these moms, and now they're little 12-monthers. And we saw again these continued concerns around COVID worries and how that impacted their babies at this point, their baby social development. And that leads to where we are now. So during all of this, what happens when you don't sleep is you can become like really industrious. And so I decided I was going to put in an RO1. So I had not had a K, had some internal funding, had some T32s, but I decided that I had this idea of what needed to happen around the pandemic and understanding the way in which it was differentially impacting both women and their babies. So I put in my R with the goal of doing a longitudinal study, because we'd already sort of started that, and following moms and babies at 12 months and 36 months. The first time I got my score back, the score was, I think, like 22, which is, it sounds kind of horrible, but it's actually a good score. It's a strong score, but it's one of those scores that's on the bubble, right? So you want to be as close to 0 as possible, as close to 1 as possible. So 22 was good, but I talked to my program officer at NIMH. I was like, what do you think I should do? Should I just sort of hold this? The reviewers had given some very concrete recommendations, and it didn't make sense to not heed them, right? But by heeding them, listening to them, and responding, that meant that I was going to have to put the grant back in with this sort of revision. And that would mean that for my babies, that at that time would soon be 12 months, they would no longer be 12 months, right? I couldn't freeze time. So then I changed it. I talked to sort of everyone and their brother, decided to resubmit, and then to put it in saying that the kids would be 24 months, right? And so instead of studying them at 12 and 36, like I had originally written, allowing for the time for it to go to study section and be reviewed, that we would change the time to 24 months and 48 months. It was funded. The second score I got was a 10. So again, these were the aims of the RO1. The study is called the Prenatal to Preschool. We call it P2P, as you will sort of see. Here's our little logo, which we have on all of our products. We have T-shirts, we have cards, we have all kinds of things that we've created to give to the families, both as sort of recruitment and just like thank you for their participation over these many years. And we really wanted to understand a couple of things when it came to the pandemic's impact on mothers and children, with this particular focus on the syndemic, specifically looking at Black families. So we had 3 aims. We were looking at not just risk factors, but also resilience, right? I mean, again, I'm an infant psychiatrist, so I'm very much interested in the ways in which we can promote, early health and well-being. So we wanted to really understand what resilience looked like in these families. both from the adult perspective and from the child perspective. And then we really wanted to dig deeper into understanding the syndemic on Black women's health by having that AIM 3 really be qualitative. The other thing we did, which you don't sort of see, I didn't put here on the aims like 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, 2Z, was we decided that all this time we hadn't talked to the caregivers. So we really wanted to have an understanding from fathers and secondary caregivers about their experiences of the pandemic, their experience of their children or the child that they cared for, and their experience with their partners or these moms. So again, these really were the focus. We're really sort of longitudinally characterizing this because we were very interested from that slide I showed you back about the impacts of stress on the developing brain, really interested and invested in understanding what that looked like. And then really looking at the syndemic in this very kind of specific way of not just with the quantitative data, which we had been doing to date, but adding this qualitative aspect where we got to talk to the moms about their experiences. And then really looking at mechanisms, right? Because again, the whole point of the research, or the whole point, I think, of good research, we think about sort of translational research, is really being able to make a difference in the lives of families with very young children. And so we can only do that if we can understand mechanisms, if we can understand like the risk factors, if we can understand resilience factors, so then we know how to intervene, where to intervene, and what works best for whom and when. So this is where we are now. We, in my study, did a bunch of stuff. We sent like 387 questions to our moms at time when their babies were 24 months. We also sent a little less, maybe 300 plus questions to fathers and secondary caregivers. And those were identified by the moms. We'd known the moms by this point, but we didn't know who was their partner in raising this child. We also did video visits. When I originally wrote the grant, we weren't sure what was happening with the pandemic, what that might look like. I knew from my own clinic that parents, though they would come in, were reluctant or frightened for, at the time, children under the age of 4, for which a vaccine did not exist. When we first studied, a vaccine didn't exist for anybody. And so we decided we would do everything virtually. So we just sent a box of toys home to the families, and we did everything over Pin Zoom. At 36 months, which just has passed for us, we did clinical interviews with all the moms. We called it the Year of the Mom because we did the SCID, which is a semi-structured questions, which really sort of looks at psychiatric diagnoses using sort of the DSM-5-TR categories. We also did a qualitative interview with a sub-cohort of Black mothers. We did it with 31 Black moms. And from those interviews, we've actually found some very interesting things. One of the statements that I didn't include, but that I always remember, is a mom who'd created 2 different birthing plans. One was if things went well, because at the time that she delivered, she couldn't have her husband in the room with her. And the other one was if she died. And so I just remember sort of hearing this mom like being sort of very thoughtful, recognizing the data around Black maternal morbidity and mortality, and realizing that her birth plan that she originally created with a doula and with her husband and also the support in the room with her was not going to happen. And while she had some faith in her team, as we found from the Wake Forest Physician Trust survey, which we asked all of the parents, she still also recognized disparities in care, and so had a contingency plan in case things went completely sideways for her. We're beginning time point 7, or 48 months, in April, which is when our first little babies turned 4, because remember we started this study in April of 2020. We're going to do a similar thing in April that we did when these kids were 2, and that we're going to do video visits with the dyads, the moms and the babies. We will send again another box of toys home. That worked really well at 24 months. We did the SCID virtually. That worked really well. And we just realized it is just a pain for families to have to come into Penn or CHOP. There's a whole lot of construction. There is traffic. It is expensive. It is stressful. So we're just going to continue with the virtual visits. send the box toys home and videotape the ways in which the mom and their now 4-year-olds are interacting with these various things. We are actually tomorrow having a meeting to talk about the 48-month surveys. There are some things that we didn't include on the 24 months that we would love to include on the 48 months, but the 24 months was 387 questions. So we need to really be mindful about what we're asking our participants to do. While we are paying them for their time, we also recognize that no one wants to spend an hour completing a survey. And we want to be mindful that while the data that we're trying to gather, we think will at the end of the day help families with very young children in the midst of these kinds of crises and perhaps syndemics, we also recognize that we're asking a lot from families who have very young children. And some of these families have new babies, little ones at home, and they also have older children. And we're also going to be discussing the father secondary caregiver surveys as well, like what else we can do to be able to better understand that part of this team, since we really have only talked to them once before at 24 months. So this is kind of what's next for both P2P, is really understanding sort of this larger exposome and early development. Clearly, my interest has always been in health equity issues and the ways in which race and racism and culture impact development and early childhood, parenting practices, health and well-being. And it's recognizing that these little people are living within this much larger system. And that's what the exposome really talks about, which is really, Bronfenbrenner, right? Understanding how all of these things are impacting this little person and what that means for their health and how we can help. So since it's Black History Month, and I have a deep and abiding love for Audre Lorde, I am going to end with this quote, which is from her book, Sister Outsider. And Audre Lorde had cancer a couple of times in her life. At the time of writing this particular piece, she had cancer again and knew that it was terminal. And so she wrote this: "What I most regretted were my silences. Death, on the other hand, is the final silence. And that may be coming quickly now without regard for whether I had ever spoken what needed to be said, or had only betrayed myself into small silences while I planned someday to speak, or waited for someone else's words. Because I am woman, because I am Black, because I am myself a Black woman warrior poet doing my work, come to ask you, are you doing yours?" Here's the team. You can see it's a massive amount of folks that have helped on this project. Here is sort of my direct team down here in this lower right-hand picture, and some of them up here last year at a holiday celebration. And we also, of course, have to thank our families who've been hanging in with us since April of 2020. Thanks.
That was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Jirogi. And yes, Jirogi, sorry. Pleased to get to open things up for questions and comments. And I have one that somebody put in a private chat that I'll just start with. Could you offer your advice on how to develop qualitative research skills working with participants from diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, so when I was at Yale doing my infant and research fellowships, I was able to work with qualitative researchers. At that time, I knew I was interested in being a mixed methodologist. I thought there was a richness that you could only get from qualitative research. And so I literally spent time with them in their labs, really understanding the ways in which they formulate their questions. I took a course simultaneously at Yale in the sort of with grad students. I actually took several courses, really to understand the practices of qualitative research. And between the coursework and between the sort of literally being there and seeing the ways in which triangulation happened, how you sort of ask these questions, how you would look for thematic saturation, all of those principles that I'd learned in the course and was applying in the real world is really how I became a qualitative researcher. So there wherever you are, there's always going to be someone who's doing qualitative research. And sometimes it's just helpful to hang out with them. But then I also realized that hanging out with them is cool and it's helpful, but you need to understand the framework, right? And so that's where I did the coursework. And again, it wasn't like I was trying to get a master's or a PhD, which you could clearly also do now. But I just really wanted to understand the principles of the way that this actually worked so that I could implement it in my research. And then when I went out to UW, I again went and joined up with some qualitative researchers. And even though the research I was doing at UW and Seattle Children's Hospital was much more quantitative, because I was working with Dimitri, who's a quantitative researcher, I still had my little sort of qualitative side projects that I was interested in, and just making sure that I understood sort of the tenets of how that work actually happens.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think obviously, well, first I should say, for those who are not in this game every day, a score of a 10 on a grant means everybody in the room thought it was a perfect grant. So it happened, really, it happens so rarely. It's pretty incredible. So I think that's testament to the grant you put forward. I it's also testament to, I think what you were describing is that each of your aims has mixed methods integrated, meaning you've got quantitative and qualitative together. And one of the things I find so impactful about your presentation is that you weave that throughout your presentation as well. So you bring points home, sometimes with quantitative and sometimes with qualitative, which I think really has maximal impact. I have another question that came in. It seems much of your research centers around the birthing individual or mothers. Do you feel that there is a need to be versed in peripartum psychiatry in order to understand infant psychiatry?
So actually, no, I've sort of backed into the moms, only as a way to get to the babies, because it's just hard to get to the babies without the moms, right? So, I mean, I am an infant psychiatrist. So my training at the Child Study Center was infants to 5. But again, I was at a place that had been doing this for decades, right? And so people knew that they could bring their 6-monthers into the Child Study Center. When I went to CHOP, and even to the Seattle Children's Hospital, they didn't have that rich history, right? It was literally just me each time. And so I had to figure out some other ways to get to the littlest amongst us. And that really was by, talking to sort of birthing people, and letting them know that I was there. And then also the research really is pretty clear about the impact that maternal health has on infant health. So while I don't see the moms clinically, I always am partnering with colleagues who are either adult psychiatrists or adult psychologists who are seeing those women or those birthing people. And I think that that's the way to do it. Now, Uju Berry, with who I wrote the article, actually is a perinatal psychiatrist, and she did do it, and so did Amalia Landona-Tobon. Went up to Brown and did that fellowship. But I mean, I'm an infant person, right? So I really am interested in the infants, but infants are within these systems, right? So you can't see a baby without seeing their caregivers.
Yeah, thank you. I had the privilege of getting to supervise Uju as a resident and then learn from her as a T32 fellow. And yes, I think that infant, oftentimes you think of as dyadic psychiatry, but it is a different thing to also pick up the peripartum piece. I think we have time for, because we started 2 minutes late, we have time for one more question.
And I went over. Sorry, guys. I didn't. I should.
Please do not apologize. It was wonderful. Ty, if you could, am I saying your name correctly? If you
Absolutely, yeah, it is. Thanks so much, and thank you so much, Dr. Duragi, for sharing your incredibly inspiring and impactful research with us tonight. So I'm a PGY2 resident at one of the Hackensack hospitals in New Jersey, and interested in culturally inclusive psychotherapeutic interventions, doing a couple of QIs in that area. And, we'll be participating, in a number of conferences, but certainly I'm not seeing a clear trajectory yet toward becoming an independent researcher. You've had wonderful experiences with mentorship. How what is your advice on the trajectory, if there is an optimal trajectory toward becoming an independent researcher, clinician researcher? Is it T32? Is it taking a year for, a master's program in epidemiology? What do you suggest?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's only one path. I think that's part of this series. You'll find there are multiple paths. What I
Yeah.
will say is I found the T32 to be exceedingly helpful. You heard about my research, right? It was like at Columbia where I sort of ended up in a project through a course. And then it was at Baylor where I did it for a free trip, you know? So again, I hadn't ever thought about having a career in research. And if had you asked like baby me, like this would be mind blowing, right? That this is what I'm doing with my life. So I think that the T32 gave me the foundation that I needed because I hadn't had really any experiences that weren't ones that I'd sort of carved out of sort of nothingness. But again, what I hope this series will show all of you, and as you talk to other researchers, that there are sort of multiple ways to kind of get to the end result. And I think it really, at the time, is what makes most sense for you. Like, I mean, I told you, I really, even as a second year child psychiatry fellow, I didn't imagine I was going to do a research fellowship, right? I wanted to do an infant fellowship, that I knew. And then the more I was preparing for that grand rounds, like I was like, this is actually also kind of cool, right? The idea to develop your own question and then to be able to make a difference. So, I think you kind of have to find your own path, right? Like I literally sort of stumbled along mine. I think you all are much more strategic and that you're coming to these kinds of talks, at nighttime or the evening, wherever you might live. But I do think that there are very different ways to get to where you're going. And the fact that you're thinking about it now versus like me, who's doing it like, pretty late, probably is, I think, really going to be a service to whatever you end up doing.
Thank you so much for, for kind of normalizing that, that feeling of where to go from here.
Yeah. And I think we've all been there, right? I mean, there's some people who are like just always sort of had a very direct trajectory, but mine really was just like I would fall into things. Like literally, I had no idea what I was doing half of the time, and then learned from my experience. I thought something was really cool or interesting, or I was curious. If a psychiatrists wonder a lot, so I wondered about this experience, and I wondered about this, and that sort of led to the career that I have now. Is this sort of sense of wonder and a lot of really great people that supported me along my pathway, even when I left places that I loved, that they continued to help me think about next steps or what might be helpful. And ACAP is clearly a wonderful place to get plugged in, to get those kinds of networks built early.
That's great advice. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all for hanging out.
I love that. I love that sense of wondering a lot. And I do think also that message of, when is the right time? Well, it's always sort of the right time. I think people oftentimes feel like, is this too late, et cetera. I don't think that there's one path. So I unfortunately have to wrap things up. So thank you again, Dr. Jaraji, for spending, man, I still can't, people never get my last name correct. Veenstra Vanderwill, Dr. Jaragi, my apologies.
That's okay.
Thank you for spending time with us today. It was, I would say, enlightening and inspiring. And I'm sure that our mentees will be reaching out to learn more from you. And please do, folks, feel comfortable doing that. That's the way child and adolescent psychiatry works. Thanks to everyone who joined. And I put the survey link in the chat. Please complete that survey. That feedback's very helpful for the group as we put subsequent talks together. And please note, the next talk is coming up on Thursday, March 21 with Drs. Jack Turbin and Kevin Simon. And please have a good evening. Thanks to all. And thanks again to Dr. Jaragi.